Before the story begins, this story does not begin with an incident. It begins with the aftermath, with what remains after the outrage has expired, after the headlines have moved on, after the silence has been carefully restored. I am not speaking from a place of triumph or vindication. I am speaking from survival. That distinction matters. Victory suggests justice prevailed. Survival only means the system decided not to finish the job. There will be no suspense here about whether the truth existed. It did. It was clear, documented, and acknowledged, even by those who later pretended it was irrelevant. The question is not what happened. The question is why, in the presence of truth, nothing changed. Why evidence became negotiable. Why certainty was treated as inconvenience. Why the cost of honesty was quietly transferred to the one person least equipped to pay it. Because truth, I learned, does not disappear. It is bargained with. It is weighed against comfort, against reputation, against stability. It is passed through committees, softened by language, and diluted until it no longer threatens anyone who matters. Justice is rarely denied with force. That would attract attention. Instead, it is postponed, reframed, professionalized, until it dissolves into something respectable and harmless. And then there are apologies, not the kind that follow wrongdoing, but the kind that follow disruption. Apologies that do not correct lies but erase truths. Apologies offered not to the injured, but to the audience, to reassure society that order has been restored, that no one needs to feel uncomfortable anymore. In those moments, an apology is not remorse. It is a transaction. What follows is not a confession. I am not asking for forgiveness, understanding, or sympathy. It is not a plea, and it is certainly not redemption. What follows is an account, measured, deliberate, and unsentimental, of how a society confronted the truth, recognized it, and then calmly instructed it to kneel. Chapter 1. The Recording. The recording exists not as a product of paranoia, but of lived experience. It is a deliberate act, born from the awareness that some truths demand preservation before they can be confronted. Every moment captured is a shield, a record of what occurred, a safeguard against the distortions that power can impose. It is not intended as a weapon. It is insurance, a measure of control in a world where control is rarely equitable. The imbalance of power is palpable, though it is never spelled out in detail. It is sensed in the pauses, in the hesitation of others, in the unspoken hierarchies that shape every interaction. The recording is both a witness and a counterweight, acknowledging that those with authority often bend facts to suit convenience while the vulnerable bear disproportionate risk. Legally, the narrator understands a harsh truth. Allegations unsupported by evidence are punished, more severely than documented transgressions. In this calculus, the recording is not merely a tool of memory, but a safeguard against an unjust system. Its existence signals preparedness, not aggression, a quiet insistence that truth, when preserved, cannot be ignored. Notably, the recording is not hidden. It is kept openly, deliberately, because secrecy carries the weight of shame. To conceal it would be to accept vulnerability, to acknowledge fear. Instead, its presence asserts confidence, a clear, unflinching declaration that what has been witnessed is real, accountable, and undeniable. In essence, the recording is a testament to foresight, an artifact of self-preservation, and a silent challenge to the structures that seek to distort, dismiss, or punish the messenger rather than the act. It exists in plain sight, deliberate, unyielding, and prepared to confront whatever consequences may come. Chapter 2. When the truth went public. The recording was released, not with fanfare, but with the quiet inevitability of a truth finally unbound. Almost immediately, the world reacted. Social media buzzed, conversations multiplied, and the recording became a prism through which public sentiment refracted. Headlines demanded attention, not justice. Every click, every share, every retweet carried the weight of moral judgment, carefully curated as outrage rather than inquiry. Media coverage, while extensive, was already complicit in subtle ways. Virality mattered more than consequence. The story's reach eclipsed its accountability. Panels dissected tone and propriety, ignoring the substance of what had occurred. Journalists framed the recording as sensitive, a matter requiring caution, rather than a record of clear wrongdoing. The act itself became background, the performance of reaction foregrounded. In observing this, the narrator recognized a disquieting truth. The world was consuming the evidence, not protecting it. Attention, applause, debate. These were distractions, not mechanisms of accountability. The recording, intended as a shield for truth, was being absorbed into a spectacle, its meaning reshaped, its purpose diluted. The audience was no longer invited to reckon with the act. They were invited to judge the messenger. And in that shift, the narrator understood the peril inherent in exposure. Truth, once public, is not always emancipatory. It can be commodified, framed, and redirected, its power harnessed by those more concerned with optics than justice. The release had not freed the story. It had set the stage for its reinterpretation. Chapter 3. The Shifting Narrative. As the recording spread, the story began to slip from my control. Public discourse pivoted subtly yet decisively. Attention shifted away from the act itself and toward me, the one who had documented it. Questions were no longer about wrongdoing. They scrutinized my behavior, my judgment, my intent. Why had I stayed? Was my tone appropriate? Did I respect protocol? Moral frameworks, professional expectations, and cultural norms were invoked to transform evidence of misconduct into a critique of character. Even my past was unearthed and framed as motive, diverting scrutiny from the act itself to the messenger. Media complicity was no longer subtle, it was deliberate. Interviews were selectively edited, clips reframed to emphasize hesitation, a pause, or a fleeting expression easily misconstrued. Headlines grew ambiguous, suggesting nuance and complexity while evading accountability. Editors urged balance, producers recommended softer angles, and silence was praised as prudence. Coverage prioritized perception over substance, shaping the narrative to protect institutions, reassure audiences, and maintain social equilibrium rather than confront wrongdoing. Panels debated tone instead of facts. Opinion columns scrutinized propriety rather than action. Social media mirrored this redirection. Initial outrage was reframed into discussions of morality, risk, and decorum. Influencers who had hailed my courage began questioning my judgment. Public sentiment was curated, deliberately steered toward reassurance that order remained intact. Even applause became conditional, measured against an unspoken standard of acceptable behavior. The recording, once a shield of truth, became a point of vulnerability. No serious figure disputed the authenticity of the recording. Its reality was undeniable. Yet the story was recast. Courage became recklessness. Evidence became provocation. And the messenger, the one who had acted with foresight, was subtly repositioned as the problem. The narrative was no longer about accountability. It was about containment. Truth, once protective, was weaponized against me. The first hints of institutional betrayal surfaced almost immediately. Legal advisors grew cautious, framing discussions around risk, reputation, and public perception rather than rights and remedies. The recording, though indisputable, was now considered a liability, a record too disruptive, too uncomfortable, too challenging to existing hierarchies. Justice was no longer the goal. Negotiation and containment had taken precedence. Evidence existed, but its power was neutralized by the very structures designed to enforce accountability. Through this convergence of media and institutional control, a deeper realization emerged. The press does not defend power, it negotiates with it. It interprets, mediates, and contains, amplifying courage, or erasing it according to what audiences and authority are willing to tolerate. Truth alone proved insufficient. It required framing, softening, and if necessary, sacrifice to preserve social and institutional order. The narrative, once mine, was now curated by others. My foresight, documentation, and meticulous recording, intended as protection, had become instruments of my exposure. In this new reality, courage alone could not endure. Evidence, no matter how precise, becomes negotiable when power prefers silence. The recording's danger had never stemmed from what it revealed, but from the discomfort and accountability it demanded. Society, guided by the media, learned to ignore what it did not wish to confront. The story I had sought to control had been redirected, and I was cast into the frame not as a witness to wrongdoing, but as the focal point of scrutiny. By the end of this first shift, the lesson was unavoidable. The mechanisms of accountability, media, law, public opinion, can exist without serving justice. Truth can be present yet powerless. Exposure can be rendered harmless when the narrative is curated to protect equilibrium. The first wave of betrayal had been completed. Institutional and societal forces had aligned to contain the story, and the public had been trained to see me as the problem, not the act I had documented. In the intersection of visibility and control, I realized that recording the truth is only the beginning. To survive in a society determined to manage perception rather than confront misconduct requires more than courage, it demands foresight. resilience, and an understanding of the invisible currents that dictate which truths may endure and which will be contained. Chapter 4. The Law Withdraws. As the recording circulated and scrutiny intensified, the first signs of legal betrayal emerged. Lawyers who had once guided me with caution and strategy began to retreat. Calls went unanswered, meetings postponed, and guidance shifted from measured counsel to hesitant advice. What had begun as support became circumspection, and eventually discouragement. The case was no longer evaluated on the merits of wrongdoing. It was framed as unwinnable, a matter of probability rather than principle. The legal system revealed its true posture. The burden of proof, once shared, subtly shifted back to the victim. Rights and remedies were replaced by risk assessments and reputation management. Legal advice spoke in terms of probabilities, likelihoods and exposure, rather than justice and accountability. Evidence, no matter how clear, was rendered negotiable, its power contingent on the appetite of those in authority to pursue it. In this environment, justice became transactional. The law did not fail by accident. It failed by design. Its application was selective, determined by convenience, institutional stability and control. The system did not collapse. It chose where to intervene, where to protect, and where to remain silent. The recording remained undeniable, yet its ability to secure accountability diminished daily. Courage and documentation, intended as shields, were now exposed as vulnerabilities. The unsettling truth crystallized. The law does not operate as an impartial arbiter. It does not serve truth by default. It stands where it chooses, and in this instance, it had withdrawn from its duty, leaving evidence to exist without consequence, and the messenger to bear the burden of exposure alone. Chapter 5. Collateral damage. As institutional and public pressures mounted, the personal cost of resistance escalated. Family and friends, once sources of support, now applied subtle pressure, advice laced with worry, warnings framed as concern. Social interactions became carefully calculated. Isolation was no longer a choice but a strategy to shield loved ones from exposure. Every connection carried potential risk, every conversation a possible liability. Threats arrived disguised as counsel, veiled in politeness yet charged with implicit danger. Concerned voices urged compromise, suggesting that my pursuit of truth endangered those around me. The act of resistance, once an assertion of justice, now reverberated outward, impacting others more than the original offender. Courage, once empowering, began to feel selfish, a burden that others were asked to bear. In these moments, the weight of accountability became deeply personal. Truth, once a shield, now carried collateral consequences. To stand firm was to risk the well-being of those I cherished, while compromise threatened the very principles I had sworn to uphold. The narrator understood painfully that the path of justice is rarely linear. The cost of bearing witness is measured, not only in exposure, but in the lives affected by that exposure. The struggle became not merely about confronting wrongdoing, but about managing its ripple effects, balancing moral integrity against the imperative to protect others. Resistance had shifted from a solitary act of courage to a calculated negotiation between principle and personal cost, and in this new calculus, truth began to feel, paradoxically, selfish. Chapter 6. The Invitation. The invitation arrived with quiet civility, polite, private, and non-threatening. It carried none of the urgency or accountability that the situation demanded. No accusations were addressed, no explanations sought. There was no denial of the facts, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, only the calm assertion of control. The power at play was evident in its subtlety. The system spoke with certainty, its authority unshaken, its intentions implicit. Justice was framed not as an imperative, but as a destabilizing force, something to be managed, mitigated, or deferred. The language, the tone, and the manner of approach all conveyed one unambiguous message. The system would act only in ways that preserved equilibrium, not in service of truth. Stability, I realized, was presented as a moral good that outweighed justice itself. The invitation was not a request for explanation, nor a forum for confrontation. It was a quiet demonstration of the hierarchy of priorities. Control, calm, and reassurance mattered more than accountability. The system's face was not harsh or threatening. It was composed, deliberate, and infallibly patient, demonstrating that power does not need aggression to assert dominance. In that moment, the lesson was clear. Truth alone is insufficient in a world where stability is moralized. where institutions value order above exposure, and where the calm voice of authority can silence consequences without ever raising it. The invitation was not an overt command. It was a demonstration of how power negotiates, contains, and reframes reality to ensure that equilibrium is maintained, no matter the cost to justice. Chapter 7. The Offer. The offer arrived with an almost ceremonial politeness. An apology was presented as closure, a gesture framed as maturity and reconciliation. Silence, I was told, would demonstrate wisdom. Compromise would reflect understanding. Compensation was positioned not as restitution for harm, but as an opportunity, an invitation to accept the preordained terms and move on. Yet the unsettling truth was unmistakable. The apology had already been written. Its words were rehearsed, predetermined, and devoid of engagement with the actual events or their consequences. The outcome had been decided long before the truth was ever told, and my role had been reduced to acknowledging it. In that moment, I realized the moral rupture at the heart of the system. The gestures of reconciliation and reward were instruments of control, designed to contain, pacify, and neutralize, rather than to restore justice. Truth had existed, been observed, and then rendered irrelevant its power, eclipsed by a narrative already determined by those in authority. The offer was not an opening for dialogue. It was a conclusion imposed with the guise of civility. It revealed that in a system where stability, optics, and preemptive control dominate, outcomes are often settled before facts are heard, and moral gestures serve to codify, rather than challenge pre-existing decisions. Chapter 8. The Apology. The apology arrived as a carefully orchestrated public ritual. Every detail, the venue, the phrasing, the tone, was staged to convey control and composure. Passive language replaced direct acknowledgement. Self-blame substituted for any real accusation. It was less a statement of truth than a performance designed to neutralize the narrative. The public responded as expected. Relief, praise, and forgiveness flowed, not for justice, but for the preservation of order. The powerful were absolved, the uncomfortable questions left unasked. Media headlines celebrated the resolution, framing it as closure and harmony, and no follow-up inquiries were encouraged. The disturbing outcome was undeniable. The apology had restored social equilibrium at the expense of accountability. Truth remained present, yet powerless. Courage, evidence, and the act of bearing witness were subsumed under the spectacle of reconciliation. In this ritual, the system demonstrated its capacity to erase dissent, contain discomfort, and redirect attention from wrongdoing to performative contrition. Stability once again had been elevated above justice. Chapter 9. The Reward. The reward did not arrive loudly. There was no announcement, no public reckoning, no visible acknowledgement of what had occurred. Instead, it unfolded quietly, efficiently, and without disruption. The offender advanced, subtly repositioned, discreetly elevated, absorbed into the continuity of institutional life. Progress was framed as normalcy, as proof that stability had been preserved. Institutions congratulated themselves in muted ways. Statements spoke of lessons learned, processes strengthened, and harmony restored. Internally, the system marked the episode as resolved, not through accountability, but through successful containment. The absence of conflict was celebrated as maturity, the lack of consequences as prudence. Justice, inverted, was measured by how seamlessly life continued for those in power. I, meanwhile, was managed, relocated, advised, softened. Support was offered on terms that ensured distance rather than dignity. My presence was adjusted to fit a quieter role, one that would not reopen questions or disturb carefully rebuilt equilibrium. Survival was permitted, but only if stripped of its sharp edges, only if it no longer threatened comfort. The psychological end state was unmistakable. I had endured but without honor. I remained but diminished. The cost of truth was not eradication, but accommodation, existing within boundaries drawn by others, carrying the knowledge of what had been seen, said, and then neutralized. In this final inversion, the system revealed its ultimate logic. Wrongdoing is survivable, exposure is manageable, and justice is optional. Advancement becomes the reward for power, while endurance, quiet, compliant, and contained, is all that is left for those who dared to speak. Final chapter, the twist. The final revelation did not arrive with drama or confrontation. It came quietly, almost clinically, as a fact disclosed too late to be disputed. The apology speech, the words later praised for their restraint, balance, and maturity had been drafted long before the recording was ever released. It was prepared in advance by legal advisors tasked with planning for all possible outcomes. The truth, I realized, had not surprised the system. It had been anticipated, modeled, and accommodated. In that moment, the full architecture of power became visible. The recording had never disrupted the system. It merely activated a sequence already designed to absorb it. The language of remorse, the posture of accountability, the choreography of closure, all had been rehearsed. What appeared to the public as a response was, in reality, execution, a script retrieved, not a reckoning confronted. This understanding reframed everything that came before. Media ambiguity was no longer incidental. It was functional. Legal hesitation was not cowardice. It was coordination. The invitation, the offer, the apology, the reward, each was a deliberate step in a process that assumed the truth would surface and ensured it would do so safely. Not safely for those harmed, but safely for the system itself. The implication was devastating in its simplicity. Truth was never dangerous because it was false. It was dangerous because it was predictable. Its emergence had been anticipated, its consequences evaluated, and its disruptive potential neutralized in advance. The system did not fear exposure, it feared instability. And instability, unlike truth, could not be permitted. Every institutional response now revealed its purpose. The calm tone was not confidence, it was certainty. The call for balance was not fairness, it was dilution. The framing of justice as destabilizing was not caution, it was instruction. What was protected was not morality, but continuity. What was preserved was not truth, but order. In this society, justice is not denied outright. It is rehearsed. It is prepared in advance, carefully constrained, and released only when it no longer threatens hierarchy. Accountability is not resisted. It is simulated. What the public experiences as resolution is often the final act of a process that began long before the first question was asked. The most unsettling realization was not that powerful institutions could anticipate the truth, but that they could absorb it without consequence. Silence was unnecessary. Participation was enough. The media framed, the law hesitated, the public forgave, and the victim was expected to accept. In that convergence, exposure became erasure. The story does not conclude with hope or despair. It ends with recognition. The most disturbing injustice is not suppression, nor even denial, but the efficiency with which truth is managed, the professionalism with which consequences are avoided, and the calm precision with which moral disruption is converted into administrative closure. In the end, the system did not silence the truth. It made room for it, on its own terms, at its own pace, and without surrendering power. Truth was permitted to exist, to be spoken, even to be acknowledged. It was simply never allowed to matter. That is the twist. Not that justice failed, but that it was never meant to arrive unannounced. Not that truth was erased, but that it was organized. And in that organization, in its foresight, its rehearsal, its seamless execution, the true character of the system finally stood revealed. The end.